I have the privilege of moderating this fireside chat, so please allow me to welcome on stage my two fantastic panelists. I'll be joined by Spencer Schneier, he's the founder, Commenda, and Bert Mueller, he's the founder at California Burrito. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Bert, for being here. You know, it's an interesting story. They have a very interesting story. So actually, you know, Spencer, if we can start with you, and then Bert with you. Just a couple of lines. Just tell us your story, what Commenda does, and then, of course, what California Burrito does.
Yeah, it actually starts as a very normal story. I was working on a tech company in Palo Alto, California, with some friends. They then lost their visas. They had to come back to India. This was in 2021. Made the decision to come with them and just sort of fell in love with the country. You could sort of say I never left, and discovered the problem that eventually became Commenda, which is that we had to incorporate a business in the United States from India. And then, yeah, like I said, just never left, and that was sort of the end of the story.
Fantastic. So we'll hear more from you about that. But Bert, you know, tell us your story, California Burrito here in India.
Sure. So I had first moved to India in 2010, and as Dr. Velumani had mentioned, I found India to be an incredibly happening place. So I decided, as I was wrapping up my education, that I would move back to India, and business was to be the route. You know, at that time, the U.S. economy actually wasn't doing so great. There was a recession going on, and India clearly had this tremendous energy and was going in a great direction. So moved here, started out with California Burrito, which is a Mexican QSR brand. We have 100 stores now across 4 cities in India, and it's been a very interesting and you know, wonderful journey.
Fantastic. Spencer, have you tried out California Burritos?
I'm absolutely certain everyone in the office is laughing right now back in Bangalore, because not only have I tried it, I probably order it almost every day.
All right.
Thank you.
Loyal customer there, all right. But you know, Spencer, when you moved from Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, and you moved to India, which is, okay, so Bengaluru is called India's Silicon Valley. But you know, of course, India is as such, it's a rewarding market, but it's a tough market. What was, I mean, yes, because of fortune, your friends were moving here, but what was it that you came here and then you realized that, there is something here, let me stay on, let me do something here? What was the magic moment, the eureka moment?
Yeah, I actually remember it perfectly. So I was riding in an Uber through the HSR layout, Kormangala neighborhoods, and I kind of looked around. And it was like, this feels exactly like I'm in Palo Alto. There's, you know, startups on every building, and you know, combining that with just the unbelievable talent that I met on my first trip here, like founders that learned how to build drones on the internet, and you know, storing data in DNA, and all of these just sort of extremely advanced technological companies. And that combined with the vibe and kind of the openness of Bangalore, it was just really cool. And not always the easiest market, but definitely one that's worth cracking.
All right. But similar question for you. Mexican food in India, what were you thinking? Okay, because I'm sorry, I'll be a little bit of a generalization, and I know it's not true for everyone, but generally, you know, people think, oh, a lot of Indians eat vegetarian food, and hey, what are the options in vegetarian food? But when they come to India, and I've got a lot of friends, I have cousins from Germany, and when they started, and they're just like, wow, there is so much options in veg food. So what was the thought of saying, hey, let's do Mexican food in India?
So when I had studied here, I lived with a family in Jaipur, and on our program, there was someone from Mexico, and she would cook food for the families, and Mexican food seemed to be the only outside food that people even liked. I remember I had brought some chocolate truffles from Switzerland or something, and I remember the next day I came in and people had cooked it up with the sugar and the milk. But clearly Mexican food was resonating, and I love Mexican food, so when I was looking at what concepts or what businesses I could do in India, this was the one that was just first one in my head. And as soon as I got back to the U.S. and I started looking at Mexican restaurants, I noticed how many people were Indians at them, and often for vegetarian reasons, the only cuisine in the U.S. that you could have really good vegetarian food. But I loved Indian food. I loved Mexican food. I thought if I like it, maybe people in India will also be on the same wavelength.
Wow, the leap of faith and how it's turned out so well now. That's fantastic. Spencer, I know that your company, you're also helping Indians expand globally. What are some of the common guidance that you give? I mean, because we have an audience full of startups, MSMEs, that would be hoping to go global. Many of them have maybe started on the journey. What are some insights that you could share with them?
Generally speaking, I think there's this idea. I'm actually going to take this question, and I'm actually going to flip it a little bit. I think there's this idea among a lot of the entrepreneurs who I meet with, and I don't want to dispel it too much because it's good for business that people think this, but that they have to go sell overseas, and they have to go sell overseas, and all the good customers are overseas. But as someone who did the opposite, I think all these ideas about the Indian market, they're very much changing. I think it's actually a terrific place to sell. It's very much a trust market. In that first interaction, you're going to be fighting tooth and nail for sometimes literally every dollar. We sell products for tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I will still have customers in India negotiate. I have a deal right now that they're arguing over $120 difference. And, the thing with India that I think works so well is once you build that relationship with somebody, I've never seen a market where they'll come back to you for everything. They'll trust you for everything. And I do think there's something to be said for that. And maybe my sort of counterintuitive advice is that Indian businesses should just build for India. They should just invest in India. It's one of the most obviously fast-growing economies in the world. And it's a great place to do business in a lot of ways.
Fantastic. That's actually kind of resonating with some of the earlier conversations with some of the earlier speakers also, and just talking about the scope that India has, the future that the Indian market provides. So that is important insights. Thank you for that. But I have a devil's advocate question for you, right? Because have you experimented with some kind of maybe a fusion between Indian foods and Mexican food? I don't know. Do you have a dosa flavored burrito or a chaat flavored burrito?
So I think in the first 5 years of running California Burrito, there was certainly this thought that how do you make it attractive to people in India? How do you make it match their taste? And I think we did experiments with the Rogan Josh burrito, or with the changing the tarka. We used almost the desi tarka in the beans.
Yeah.
But over time, I think my parents had moved to Mexico. I kept going back to Mexico. And I realized that, the original thing is probably the ultimate thing. And so then after 2018, the journey really was about how do you get the original taste in India. And primarily the issue was ingredients, and not being able to get the ingredients that Mexicans, or even in California, in the U.S., the ingredients that would go into the food. And so that's when we started getting into farming. And so we had imported, about 500 Hass avocado trees, and then we started growing tomatillos and chilies and beans and corn now. But just kind of that journey of trying to bring alive the same taste you would get. The presumption being, instead of trying to go fusion or trying to adapt to the local market, instead maybe the original thing was already very good, and people were already liking it who were from India. So I think that has become my thought. If I was to have Indian food in the U.S., I would probably want it from that school of thought.
Well, that kind of makes sense because, Indians do love experimenting, and we'd be, I'm sure, and I mean, your success also speaks volumes about that, where we are glad to have another cuisine as an option to try out. Very often, I mean, unlike Spencer, maybe having every day. Spencer, one thing that's changed over time is speed. So speed has become integral part of business today, especially in the startup world. Things change overnight almost, Maybe if you could share an example with the audience where kind of moving fast gave you a competitive advantage in India, how you navigated the country's unique regulatory and also some operational challenges while scaling your business. Could you tell us a little bit about any incident like that?
Yeah. I think as a startup, speed is always the most important metric in a lot of ways. Something we say a lot at Commenda is that, speed kind of forgives all sins when you're a startup. And, it's funny, maybe this is one of my very American beliefs, but as a startup, if you're doing well and you're moving fast, you can always raise more capital. And I always hate to say that maybe you shouldn't be frugal because I know I'm going to get gasps in the audience, but maybe you shouldn't be frugal. That's what the venture capital money in Bangalore is for. And but I think just moving fast, it gives you an advantage over your opponents. Obviously, it helps you stake turf both in the minds of your customers, investors, and also, with your competitors to an extent, right? I think a lot of founders. This is something I've seen, something I've made the mistake of, is not having the courage to enter a market when there's already a company that's there.
Oh.
But it's usually not close, right? The execution's usually not close. There's usually just one that's way better than the other. So, but no, I think speed has all these advantages.
Ah, interesting. That's quite an interesting, a different take, and I'm sure the audience will have a lot of food for thought on your view and other views of other experts. That's quite an interesting take. But you're in the QSR space, quick service restaurants. The space in India is highly competitive. I've seen in malls, so I'm from Mumbai, but I've seen in malls where you will see a certain kiosk and maybe 6 months later that's gone and a new kiosk, a new cuisine has come up there. What were some of the toughest challenges that you faced while you were scaling up?
Well, I think when I first moved here, I was 22 and did not have any experience in business or really even much in food. I had worked in a QSR brand in the U.S. So I think the first challenge that I had was getting the right people in place. And I think there was a high learning curve, probably being so young and not from the industry and not in a country that I had grown up in. That I think getting great trustworthy people in place, there was a lot of lessons that were learned till we reached that point. But once we hit a certain scale, I think getting the product right became the biggest challenge. And I think getting back to this thought of do you try to do some sort of a fusion thing, or do you stay true to the original cuisine? Yeah. And what is the what's the right approach to take on that? So I think it probably, we had done, I would say, a good job before COVID, but after COVID, we did a much better job because COVID forced us to take some decisions that we may not have taken if we hadn't been, been pushed up against a wall. Absolutely,
yeah. Definitely, it was a black swan event, changed the trajectory for many companies. So this is a question for both, and Spencer, I'd like you to go first and then Bert. For entrepreneurs outside India that are looking to come to India, what would be maybe your piece of advice to them? How do they navigate this space? Any sectors that you think are great here? So Spencer, you first, and then Bert, if you could get your thoughts also.
This is probably an entire book that we could sit down and write, but maybe we shouldn't, and then we can keep having a big share of the market. Someone mentioned the tariffs, that the U.S. was doing tariffs earlier, but has anyone ever looked at India's tariffs? They're very high, but no. Just the point I made earlier that that first interaction with people is going to be very different than what it would be in the U.S. or in Europe or most of the rest of the world. But that it's such a trust-driven market. If you're a restaurant, right? Like if you have quality food and it's consistent, people are going to come back. If you're a software company and you solve their problems and you don't have too many bugs and you have good customer support, they're going to come back for more and more things. And I think, my friends in the U.S., when they maybe get an Indian customer and they get frustrated with all the haggling and the demands of like custom features, they quit and walk away. It's like that meme with the guy with like the pickaxe, and he's almost to the gold, and then he turns around. It's very much like that, and you just have to be very patient with the Indian market.
Okay, important to be patient. But your piece of advice.
So I would have to agree with the last comment about. My philosophy that I always say is India favors the patient. But I think the real thing I would say is that I had two other co-founders who came from the U.S. with me, neither of whom were Indian, and one lasted about a year. The other did last about 7 years. But I think if you don't love if you don't love the place you've gone, maybe even it starts with the food. If you don't love Indian food, probably don't start a business in India. Because maybe the food is almost the ultimate representation of what the people are and what the culture is. Yeah. And so my first business partner who lasted a year, he just hated the food. The other one liked the food, and I love the food, and yeah. I'm the last one here. So I think if you give love to the place that you've come, then certainly you can get love back. But if you don't have that in the first place, don't come.
Wow, important insights. Thank you so much, Spencer. Thank you, Bert. We're running out of time almost, but it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to both of you and to hear your stories and your journeys. Thank you so much. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Spencer and for Bert here.